So occasionally talk here in the morning. The senior pastor is out raising funds for the next step and next journey of our church's mission in the city. And this morning, I also am in a doctoral program for science and theology. So bringing those two fields together in my doctoral research. Mostly looking at neuroscience and spiritual growth. But that's not this morning's talk. This morning's talk is part of this. The theme we're on is currently Ask Me Anything. And a lot of questions that people have in regard to Christianity has to do with suffering and evil in all its various forms. You don't have to go very far to find examples. Even just in the news this morning, I was looking up. There was a blurb by Anne Graham Lotz, part of the Billy Graham family. She has a new book out. And she was saying that we're at a point now where there's more Christians not in church on Sunday morning than are in church, but who still claim to be Christians. And a lot of them say the reason they are not in church is because someone in the church has hurt them. Personally, I think a lot of Christians aren't in church Sunday mornings because they're working and they can't help it. But there's still a large population that don't go to church because some Christians have been mean to them. And then you have all the suffering you see in the world from 9/11, the tsunami in the Indonesia area. These situations bring up questions in the whole population. Okay, why is there evil? Even atheists start asking this. Or in a recent news report, I mean, some of the things people do, one that really got me, since I now have a child who's standing over there making faces at Dad. Hi, Kayla. Is that here a report in China that it's dangerous now for parents to leave young children, to not be watching young children, because there are people that will pay big money for children's eyes. For cornea transplants. And there's been cases where a parent just turns around for a second, turns back around and found someone has pulled their child's eyes out and ran off. That's scary. Problem of evil. There is suffering in the world and people do horrible things. Which brings up the question is, where is God in all of this? The usual philosophical argument for the issue is, well, Christians claim God is omnipotent, so he's all-powerful. God is omniscient, all-knowing. God is perfectly good, and there's evil and suffering in the world. So, but if God is all-powerful, he'll be able to prevent all the evil. I mean, he can do it. He's that powerful. He could end all the suffering. If God is all-knowing, he knows about all the evil and suffering. So not only does he know about it, he can do something about it, but isn't. And then if God is perfectly good, wouldn't God want to prevent all the evil and suffering in the world? So when you take that, it's like, well, if evil and suffering exist, then God is either not all-powerful, not all-knowing, or not all-perfectly good. It's either God does not exist or does not have the character Christians claim. Little meme, I don't help people because I can't help them, I don't want to help them, and I don't exist. The response is usually, so, but what if God has a compelling reason to allow evil and suffering? This little demotivational poster, mistakes. It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others. But does every evil have to serve a greater good? You often hear something terrible happens and someone will tell them, try to comfort this person. That was God's will. It was God's will for that murder or that assault. I just want to dispel that. No. Every evil does not have to serve a greater good, and every evil does not have to be in God's will. When I look at the Bible, God sent Jesus to correct sin. God has a problem with sin. He wants to make it better. I don't see God at the same time being schizophrenic, saying, I want to try to stop sin. I'm going to send Jesus to cure sin, and at the same time I'm going to will sin. Don't see that. It's true, God can work bad things and bring some redemption out of it, bring some good out of it, but it doesn't mean the bad thing God wanted to happen. I was at a debate between a well-known Christian professor and a well-known atheist out in Kentucky, and the atheist threw down the gauntlet to the Christian man and said, whatever reason you give for explaining evil and suffering, you have to be able to give it straight to the face of a child who's dying in the Holocaust and have it be meaningful. If you can't do that, then your reason is ridiculous and perverse. So that's the challenge. Can you give a reason in that situation? We'll get to that. First, before we start answering the problem of evil from a philosophical point of view, it's really important to know, why is this person asking the question? Is the question being asked, I want to philosophically analyze the Christian worldview and seek to reconcile it with what I see in the world? Or is that a smokescreen for, I personally have experienced evil and cannot make sense of it, and I haven't healed emotionally from the experience? Oftentimes people will say, but what about the disaster in New Orleans or the tsunami in Indonesia? And really that's their way of saying, I hurt personally, but it's way too risky to open up about my own personal pain, so I'm just going to ask for something out there. Ask about that. If someone is asking about their own personal issues and pain, a philosophical answer is not going to mean much. It's going to be BS. Yes, this is the first poop slide in 360 Church.
No, second.
No.
Second? Oh no, you meant, yeah, Will, second. Sorry, Will. You're giving the snaps. But yeah, it's not going to mean, a philosophical answer to someone who's hurting is not going to mean anything. In that case, what someone needs is empathy and care. They need a hug, they need understanding. They need to be shown God's love from someone who's Christian who can show God's love. They don't need an intellectual answer. And so if someone's asking these questions, know kind of what they're trying to get at. The first thing we look at, moral evil. These are the bad things people do to other people. Why do people do such bad stuff, and why is it permitted to happen? I mean, that's an old black and white photograph from Auschwitz. The usual answer is, it's permitted because God allows free will. This is a little public service announcement. For the cost of a cup of coffee a day, you can have a cup of coffee every day, just for you. And for only 34 cents more, they'll put whipped cream on it. Take care of yourself first. You deserve it. It's kind of funny, but people are selfish. People do bad things to other people. They serve their own self-interest, and it frequently hurts others. And so in response to moral evil, is people have free will. And to have real love, there needs to be the choice not to be able to love. And people can choose against God with all the bad that entails. God is the ultimate respecter of people's choices. And can you imagine, well, if your choices were only somewhat free, I can choose A through F, but once I try to choose G, I'm going to be stopped every time. Or some miracle poof is going to happen, and it's going to stop. The world becomes increasingly confusing and weird. And so God says, okay, I'm going to allow people to choose so real love can exist. You're not going to be robots, you're not going to be programmed. If I was forced to love someone, that wouldn't be real love. But that means people can do bad things. And the response is to, here's more. But why do evils have to be so numerous? Why doesn't God intervene more? And why does pain have to be so painful? It's like, okay, we can allow some evil because of the need for free will, but why does it have to be so much? Why doesn't God cure cancer more? And why does the very pain we experience have to be so painful? Why couldn't when I lay my hand on a hot stove, I feel mild discomfort instead of blazing hot pain. Couldn't that be enough to let me know I better take my hand off the stove? Or I better go see the doctor? Why does it have to be so bad? One, Jesus didn't heal everybody. There was a crowd. Jesus healed that one and that one. And he didn't heal everyone. It's a question we don't really have an answer to. Why not? But it was there from the beginning. The Bible doesn't. The Bible has the same issue. And we are unable to determine or assess what level of divine intervention is permitted before the whole lawful structure of the world breaks down. Perhaps the current state of affairs is what one is left with after allowing for the maximum amount of God's intervention. And evils occur in a vast web of relationships where you're not able to determine the consequences of intervention. We are still people. We don't have God's perspective. I've heard some people talk about, stop the prayers, go disturb the devil. Just kidding, keep praying. But I've heard some people explain, think of all the bad that had to happen in the world for you to even exist. Example, my grandfather escaped World War II, escaped Austria right before World War II because he saw what was coming, escaped to California to work in the steel mill. There he met my grandmother. They got married. If it wasn't for World War II, I would not exist. Now, I can't say I'm thankful for World War II, but it's still there. And what about all the things that had to have happened for you to even be around? What if God intervened here and all of a sudden I didn't exist? We just don't know what kind of interventions can happen, what can't. And when you throw a rock in a pond, there's ripples. You don't know what those ripples will be. Good and bad. And so this basically just says we have to be humble when we approach trying to question God about these things. Why don't you intervene more? We're not in a really position to answer that because we don't have the full picture of the whole world, past, present, and future. Or there's that question, why does pain have to be so painful? That is photoshopped, not real. Case studies of painlessness. It's like, so why do we have to have pain in all its agony? Well, there are cases where people don't have pain. Leprosy. You read about it in the Bible, you see, and you hear about people without fingers, without toes, without noses. Well, leprosy actually doesn't cause any of that. All that leprosy does is it stops your nerves from firing. It kills your nerves. For those more scientifically minded, leprosy inflames the myelin sheath around your nerves so that the nerve inside dies. It gets crushed out. And so why are people missing fingers and toes? Because they no longer feel. They get a small cut, they don't know they get a cut, it gets infected, becomes more serious, something has to be amputated. Or, and this is gruesome, so sorry, at least in third world countries, certain animals like rats have realized those with leprosy are a good food source while they sleep because they won't wake up. And so that's why you read about these leprosy people that are missing limbs and stuff. It's because they don't feel pain. Not having pain can be quite horrible. Or congenital pain deficiency or insensitivity. These are people that are born without the ability to feel pain in its full painfulness. They feel the tickle. They put their hand on a hot stove and they feel mild irritation. These people rarely live past their preteen years because they simply can't take care of themselves, or they don't care. As with cases of leprosy, if you stop being able to feel pain in your certain limbs, you no longer see that as part of yourself. It becomes a tool and you don't care if it gets hurt. Another graphic example, there's cases of younger kids that have this where their fingers are like a crayon. It's just a tool. And so they will like cut off part of their finger or bite off part of it so they can write with it. Yeah, people are grimacing. Yeah. And that's why they don't live very long. You have to be able to teach them how to care for themselves without the ability to feel pain, which is really tough. It can happen occasionally. Or animal studies, back in the 1940s, they did studies where they raised puppies in a painless atmosphere. They never felt pain until then they were an adult dog. They let them out to do dog things. And they could not navigate the world. One of the experimental protocols was they would light a match and hold it down in front of the dog, and the adult dog would stick his nose into the flame and yelp, but never pull his nose out. Granted, this is before a lot of the animal protocols are in place not to do these studies. I don't think this study was very humane, but it was still done and we have the knowledge from it. If they didn't experience pain from the time they were a puppy, they didn't know how to respond to pain when they were adults. They didn't know to pull their nose out. And so really, when you ask the question, why does pain have to be so painful? Well, we have the cases where it's not, and they're horrible. And so, yeah, when it looks at creation, pain needs to be as painful as it is. Then you get the side effect, though, is sometimes when you get hurt, you can't fix it, and so you have kind of this congenital ongoing pain. But that's the price to pay to be able to have pain at all. And to have pain means we can actually navigate through the world successfully and keep our limbs intact and ourselves alive. So those talked about moral evil. Okay, we have free will, we have the ability to love, but we also have the ability not to love. Moral evil, we explain it by free will. But this still does not explain natural evil. Okay, people do bad things to other people, but then why do we have to have things like tornadoes and hurricanes and tsunamis? And that's actually someone's painting. And also, yeah, in the movies, isn't it terrible? The Golden Gate Bridge always gets it in disaster movies. More so than even the Empire State Building. The Golden Gate always gets it. But in natural evil, we also have to talk about animal suffering. Why does the rest of creation have to suffer for the purpose of morally developing humans and our ability to choose for or against God? For our ability to have free will, why does the entire rest of creation and animals have to suffer? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And there's animal suffering that has nothing to even do with people. Why does it have to exist? A forest fire started by lightning. Is all that suffering just for humans? That seems very self-centered. It gets worse when you hold to evolution. With evolution, there's been millions of years of nature, red in tooth and claw, of animals eating other animals, predation, and the vast majority of species that have ever existed are extinct. And that was even before humans appeared. Was all this for humans? Seems like God is paying an awful high price on the backs of others, I mean the animal world, just for people. Well, in terms of natural evil, part of moral development and being a rational creature involves being able to consider your potential actions and anticipate consequences. It means the world has to have a kind of a lawful cause and effect way about it. If every time I went to stick a fork in a socket, it always stopped, I'd never really learn not to do that. You need to be able to anticipate consequences. Okay, if I do this, this will happen. If I don't do this, this will happen. And you develop and grow that way. You need a lawful world this way. This has to learn to act morally for its own sake. This world must also be impersonal and immoral. If good always happened to me when I did good, and bad always happened to me when I did bad, well, I'd do good for getting good stuff, and I would avoid bad to avoid bad stuff. It's like, you need to be able to be moral beyond that. Beyond just, I'm being good so I can get the candy. Even as parents, I want my new little boy to be able to be good for the sake of goodness, for the sake of God. Whether good or bad happens, still be good. I think that's what God wants for us as well. So you have this lawful world, and as the Bible says, it should be printed on the little handout, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. The sun rises on the just and the unjust. The Bible even says, hey, good things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. And bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. It's the way it works. Even in Job, a book I personally still have trouble with, when Job says, why God? And God says, not telling you. And the reason I have a problem with it is like, but God, in Job chapter 1, Job is having these problems because you made a divine bet with Satan. Couldn't you just fess up to Job and said, yes, all this disaster happened to you because I needed to make a divine bet? Instead, you try to play the mystery card and say, oh, it's all too big for you, Job. Well, I think there's more to it than that. I've really thought about this. Granted, it is all too big for Job because Job doesn't know all the reasons for it. Granted, Job may have started out on a divine bet, but there was a whole lot more reasons to it. And Job could have never known all the people that have been impacted by the very book that was written about him for the next thousands of years. And God couldn't have told him all that. Let me tell you about this guy named Alan who's going to think about your book. And let me tell you about all these people in America that are going to think about your book. And Job's mind would have been blown. And that would have had more suffering than what he's already going through. And so God just said, there's a whole lot of ways in the world works. There's a little bit beyond you. Keep going, have faith, and that's kind of the way it ends. But so to learn to act morally for its own sake, the world must be impersonal and immoral. Good things need to be able to happen to everybody and not be strictly tied to whether you're doing good or bad. Granted, you can avoid a lot of bad in your life by not sinning. Let me just clear that up. When I'd preach to addicts, I used to be a counsel and be a chaplain to people with addiction problems. I'd tell them, sure, if you get sober, it doesn't mean all the bad will be gone for your life. And all good will just happen. But if you get sober, you can still cut out things like court dates, DUIs, having bad trips. You do cut out a good portion of the bad in your life. So let's just put that out there. Yeah, do avoid sin. But bad things can still happen. This is a real picture taken by some firefighter. That deer in the middle of a river where the fire goes around him. But, I mean, if you're in the animal world, you also need a lawful world to exist. You need to be able to anticipate cause and effect, to be able to live your own lives. And a lawful world that's built for cause and effect has things like weather systems that can go bad, lightning that can cause fires. Back to talking about the Bible, what is God's answer to evil? When you study the Bible, okay, God, why is there evil and suffering in the world? God does not explain it. Like Job, he says, it's beyond you. God doesn't explain our suffering, God shares it. The cross of Christ means that God has chosen to share in the suffering of the world. It's not just for salvation. Yes, salvation, very important. And core, central. But the cross also says, it's God's way of saying, I'm not immune to the suffering of creation myself either. I've chosen to create, and I'm going to be willing to take the suffering of creation on myself as well. And the fact that there's a resurrection after crucifixion shows that suffering is also not the final word. There can be a victory. So God, when you look to the cross, even Elie Wiesel, who's a member of a concentration camp, wrote a book on suffering and evil, looks to the fact that God suffers with him as a way of knowing and being comforted. Also, what about the animal world? They're suffering. You look at Romans 8, even creation awaits a redemption. There's some meaning of the cross even for the whole wider creation. The Bible doesn't give us much detail on what that is, so theologians speculate all over the place. But there is still something there. All creation waits for redemption, not just all people, humans. And there's an interesting thing that was pointed out to me in one of my Bible classes. It says Jesus became flesh. The word for flesh is materiality. It doesn't just say Jesus became flesh, people flesh, but took on all of creation, materiality. So what is that? So people speculate off of that one too. It says there is a wider meaning for the cross of Christ, including our own salvation. That's Romans 8:28. Isaiah 53:5. God can heal our suffering and bring something good out of it. All things work for good for those that love God. Does that mean everything is good to begin with? No. Does it mean that everything was God's will to begin with? No. There's some things that are just bad. But God can still work with it. God can take a pile of poop and turn something, and bring at least some kind of good out of it, so that the bad is not the final word. So we go back to that atheist's challenge when he threw down the gauntlet and said, whatever reason you give for evil has to be given straight to the face of a child dying in the Holocaust. Well, I say the challenge could be given right back. Can you give your atheist position in the same situation? The atheist response to suffering? Okay, can you say straight to the face of someone dying in the Holocaust, there is no God, your suffering is the end of the story, it is in vain, and there is nothing else, this is it. That seems like there's no comfort. To me, that's what seems perverse. That's what the atheist was challenging the Christian on. I would rather be able to say, there is a God who suffers with you, because God cares that much. A good God where this suffering is not the end of the story, where redemption can be found, and who can bring some meaning to the worst of the darkness. That seems to have a little more impact and a little more meaning than there is nothing else, sorry. So this is kind of just a basic look at the problem of evil. And it really comes back to, sure, we can surmise and talk about reasons, free will, love, having a lawful world. Pain has to be as painful as it is. This is still not too comforting when you're hurting, or you're worried about the hurting of someone you know. But it is still something. And God has given us the cross of Christ to know that God suffers with us, and also to teach us to be willing to suffer with our fellow people. And we can be God's answering to the suffering of the world. Yeah. If we're willing to let God work in us and let us be that type of person who can shoulder each other's burdens. And that, when someone's hurting, that is the best Christian answer to evil and suffering, is to be part of the solution, letting God work through us. It comes back to the cross. Dear Lord, thank you for the cross of Christ. We can't explain all the pain and all the suffering, but you are there with us, you walk with us, and I pray that you'll give us the eyes to make a difference in the pain and suffering that we see around us, so that pain is never the final word, but your love is. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.